Sorry about that. Zoom has been acting up with me lately. I don't know what the problem is. I have to call the school. Every time I type in my information, it tries to claim that I'm typing in the wrong password, which I'm not. And then I have to ask it to go change it. And then all of a sudden it changes its mind and says, no, this is the right password. Okay, you're in. It's very strange. But anyway, so last time we were talking about inflation, and we did see some interesting videos about that. But before we do that, go back and revisit this chapter. It turns out that we're actually getting close to having a second midterm. And geez, I guess I didn't write it down there. It looks like, oh, maybe it's a little too soon for that. No, okay, I think it's a little early for that. I think the second midterm is supposed to be chapters 5 through 8. We haven't actually done 8 yet. So why don't we save that for next time? You can see I do try to write down all the details. Chapter 8 is the potential GDP and the natural rate of unemployment, which we wanted to cover, but we're not quite done with chapter 7 and our discussion about inflation yet. So why don't we hang on to the second sample midterm a little bit longer? The second sample midterm will cover 5 through 8. And then the final exam will be 9 through 12, I believe. That sounds right, 9 through 12. The first one is 1 through 4, which I have to admit, I don't remember what the due date was, but I don't think it was tonight. Let's see, hold on. No, maybe it was tonight. Okay, I'm seeing here it says due in 1 week. You know what, let's go back and see if I made an announcement. I should have done this before, but let me just take a quick look. I don't honestly remember what date I set for that. All right, so I'm going to go open up Blackboard real fast. And by the way, don't forget, last time it is, oh, the 10th. Oh, good. Thank you for reminding me. I couldn't remember what I'd said. Good, the 10th. I like that. That sounds like it must be Monday then. Yeah, that would be Monday. Okay, perfect. Because last time we weren't actually meeting in real time. It was a recording, which is fine, but I thought everyone should have more time for that. All right, good. So then we're right on track for everything. So what we'll do is I want to show you a handful of more videos from the inflation topic, because I think they're so good and they're so helpful. And then when we're done with that, we can start chapter 8, which is a look at the natural level of GDP. In fact, why don't we open that up? And take a look. Oh, wait, what did I do? Here we go. So under content, okay, there we go. There's chapter 8. Let's get it open. And actually, this one has its own set of videos too. These are more about policy issues. These are the different schools and how they look at economic theory and what their recommendations are. And so, of course, you know, it's that area where you can never be sure that one group is right or wrong. They all have valid points. So there's a lot of judgment involved. So, oops, that's not what I wanted. I'm going to get the chapter open. Okay, where did it go? Here we go. Yeah, this is what I meant to do. Just open this up and take a look at it. So we're going to take a look at potential GDP, the natural unemployment rate, but we're actually going to be looking at different, what they're called schools of economic thought. How do they approach economic policy making? What are the differences between them? What does each one think is the most important? How do they think these objectives can be accomplished? And they can have very different policy prescriptions. And so some of these have been tried at different points in history, and we've seen the results. Some of the, these go through phases of popularity and less popularity. Wow. No, wait a minute. What happened here? Oh, okay. I was afraid that something was missing here. So I'll tell you what, as always, I would like to do this with a PDF file so that I can, not PDF, PowerPoint slides, so that I can write on it. So in other words, this is really the first time we'll be looking at policy issues because, economics is a science, but it is practiced by politicians often. And so there are different outlooks or philosophies that, policymakers may follow. And so we'll be looking at that here. Very interesting. The history of economic thought is very, very interesting. But before we even do that, let's get back and revisit some of these very cool videos that I want you to see, because I think they'll give you a lot of insights into inflation, but not just inflation. Other very interesting topics. Let's see. Now, this is something that showed up in one of the other videos, the quantity theory of money. I think it's important to watch this one so that we'll understand what that means. This is one of the earliest attempts to show how inflation ultimately results from changes in the money supply. So I'll show this here. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Let me put this in the chat room, just in case for some reason, if you can't hear or see what's going on here, you can watch it on your own screen. So let's check this out.
Today, we're going to introduce an important tool for thinking about issues in macroeconomics, the quantity theory of money. Let's imagine the journey a dollar bill might take in a year. Imagine that the dollar bill starts with Tyler, who buys a pupusa from Don, the street vendor. Don gives it to his daughter, who spends it on a pony ride at the fair. It ends up in the hands of Alex, who, after losing it and then finding it in his couch cushions, buys a cup of coffee while on a road trip to see his favorite polka band. So in a year, this dollar has been spent 3 times on the pupusa, the pony ride, and on a cup of coffee. Okay, we've got the building blocks to understand the quantity theory of money already. Our dollar bill, well, that's money, which we represent with the letter M. How many times that dollar gets used in a year is called the velocity of money, which we'll label with a V. In this case, V is 3, as our bill was spent 3 times in a year. The pupusa, pony ride, and coffee are real goods and services, which we'll call Y. And the price of those goods and services we'll call P. These are the variables in the quantity theory of money. Now, let's think about this for an economy as a whole. M would be the money supply, all the money in the economy. V would be how many times a dollar is spent purchasing finished goods and services. Some people hoard cash under their mattress, so their dollars have a low velocity, while others spend or invest their money quickly, and their dollars have a high velocity. V is the number of times the average dollar is spent. P would be the price level of all finished goods and services in an economy, and Y would be all the finished goods and services sold in an economy. So Y is real GDP, and when you multiply it by a measure of the price level, you get nominal GDP. Same thing over here. You take all our money, M, and multiply it by how many times the average dollar was spent, or V, and you get nominal GDP as well. Both sides represent nominal GDP in a different way. So these are equal by definition, which is why we call this equation an identity. One way to think about it is that how much money we have in total times how many times the money is spent covers the actions of buyers. The stuff we sell times the prices we charge covers the actions of sellers. Given that everything that is sold is by definition bought by someone, this equation is true by definition. There are important questions about the variables and how they are measured. How do we measure M, for example? However, the core identity that M times V must equal P times Y gives us a lot of insight and a way of organizing our thought about important macroeconomic issues. So we'll return to this tool often. For example, what can this identity equation tell us about the causes of inflation? That's the topic we'll turn to next. You're on your way to mastering economics. Make sure this video sticks by taking a few.
Okay, so that was pretty interesting. Now, in the next section, as I mentioned, chapter 8, we'll be talking about the different schools of economic thought, and one of those schools, the so-called monetarist school, actually uses that equation as a starting point for a lot of their analysis, because they're of the opinion that inflation ultimately comes from increases in the money supply and nothing else. In fact, there's a very famous economist named Milton Friedman who's a monetarist, and he once said that inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon, meaning that there's a lot of things we can blame on inflation, but the reality is inflation comes about when the money supply increases faster than the amount of goods and services that are being produced in the economy. So now others have different outlooks on that, but this is sort of a foundation building block for the monetarist school of thought. And it was very popular I believe this was first dreamed up in the 1700s. I'd have to look that up. Let's just take a quick look here. When was the quantity theory of money invented? I'm going to guess the late 1700s. Oh, mid 16th century. Wow. So, okay, it goes back further than I even realized, but it was popularized by economists at a later point in history. So the first time people started talking about it in general was probably a little later than that. But anyway, so what they're trying to show you is that with that equation, you can show how, at least in the long run, an increase in the money supply can only do one thing, and that's push up the rate of inflation. So anyway, so let's get back to the next video, which I believe is this one. So I'll post this in the chat room just in case you need a copy of this link. And I'll put it here. We'll watch it.
Today, we're going to explain the primary cause of inflation. And we're going to do so using the quantity theory of money. Let's start by rewriting our equation slightly. We'll divide both sides by y, so we get this. What this equation tells us is that if prices are changing, there are three possible causes: changes in M, V, or Y. Now remember that prices, they can change quite a bit in a short period of time. There are many times and places, for example, when prices have doubled or tripled in a year. On the other hand, V and Y are pretty stable. Consider Y, that's real GDP. Real GDP, it doesn't vary that much within a year. An increase of 10% in a single year, that would be astonishing growth. And a fall of 10%, that would be a very unusual Great Depression. So changes in real GDP, they don't seem like a plausible candidate for explaining large and sustained changes in prices. What about V, the velocity of money? The velocity of money is the average number of times that a dollar is used to purchase final goods and services in a year. In the US economy in recent years, it's been about 7. And it's determined by the same kinds of factors that might determine your personal V. Factors like whether you're paid weekly or biweekly, or how long it takes to clear a check. As we'll discuss later, V can change in the short run, but it might go up to 8 or down to 6. Usually not much more than that. So again, V doesn't seem like it can change enough to explain large and sustained changes in prices. So if Y and V are relatively stable, which we'll note by adding a bar over top, then it follows immediately that the only thing that can cause an increase in P is an increase in M. In other words, increases in prices are caused by increases in the money supply. It's changes in the money supply that are driving the speed and the height of our inflation elevator. We can summarize this by writing the quantity theory of money in a nutshell. Here's our equation written in the earlier form. Now, what this equation says is very simple and intuitive. When more money chases the same amount of goods and services, prices must rise. Okay, how well does the theory hold up? In this figure, we plot the price level and the money supply from Peru during its hyperinflation. A product with a price of 1 Peruvian intus in 1980, it would have cost 10 million intus by 1995. Now, what caused this massive increase in prices? Well, just as the quantity theory would predict, we also see at this time a massive increase in the money supply. M skyrocketed, and so did P. We can also write the quantity theory in terms of growth rates, which we'll indicate with a little arrow above the variable. What the growth form of the quantity theory tells us is that if V and Y, if they're not growing too much, then the growth rate of M should be equal to the growth rate of prices. And remember, the growth rate of prices is the inflation rate. Here's the same data from Peru as before, except now we're looking at the growth rate of the money supply and the growth rate of prices. As the growth rate of the money supply increased, so did the inflation rate. Amazingly, the money supply was growing at a rate of 6,000% per year in 1990. And as the quantity theory predicts, the inflation rate, it was about 6,000% per year in 1990. Okay, so the theory works pretty well for Peru in 1990. What about other times and places? Here we show inflation rates on the vertical axis and money growth rates on the horizontal axis. This is for about 110 countries between 1960 and 1990. You can see that on average, the relationship is close to perfectly linear, with a 1 percentage point increase in the money supply growth rate, leading to a 1 percentage point increase in the inflation rate. Now, what this tells us is 3 very important principles. First, in the long run, money's neutral. A doubling of the money supply will, in the long run, lead to a doubling of prices. Second, if we're thinking about a significant and sustained inflation rate, then Milton Friedman had it exactly right when he said, quote, "Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon," end quote. Third, since central banks often have significant control over a nation's money supply, they also often have significant control over a nation's inflation rate. Okay, keep those 3 principles in mind. We'll be referring to them in future videos.
You're on your way to mastering.
All right. Well, it's getting more interesting, isn't it? So, yeah, there's that quote from Milton Friedman, and probably one of the most famous proponents of monetarism. He wrote a very well-regarded history of the monetary history of the United States, in which he talked about a lot of these same ideas, that he was trying to show the relationship between money and prices throughout US history. And he was able to show this very tight relationship between the two. Now that book was written in the 60s, so maybe it's time to update it a little. But anyway, in the meantime, let's see. Now there's one more here, which is more about the cost of inflation. There's always sort of an understanding that inflation is a problem. The question is why? So let's just take a look at this. So I'll set it up here. There we go.
Why is inflation a problem? To the person in the street, the costs of inflation are obvious. Prices are going up. What could be worse? But inflation increases all prices, including wages. If all prices are going up, what's the problem? If everyone knew that the inflation rate would be 2% or 8%, then everyone could prepare. And the exact rate, it wouldn't matter so much. But it's often the case that no one knows what the inflation rate is going to be. In the United States, the inflation rate was 1.3% in 1964. The rate then quadrupled to 5.9% in 1970. And then it went to 11% in 1974. Inflation caught people by surprise. That inflation went from 14% in 1980 to 3% in 1983. And again, people were surprised. And these changes, they were mild. In Peru, the inflation rate was 77% in 1986. But then just 4 years later, the inflation rate was running at 7,500% per year before falling back to 73% by 1992. Who could possibly predict these kinds of changes? Now, high rates of inflation do create some problems, as we'll discuss, but volatile and high inflation rates, they're really costly. We're going to look at two costs: price confusion and money illusion. Remember from our video on the price system that a price is a signal wrapped up in an incentive. We said then that an increase in the price of oil, it signals to users of oil that oil has become more scarce. And it incentivizes those users of oil to find ways to economize, such as by moving flour production to warmer climates. But when we have inflation, all prices are increasing. So price signals, they become more difficult to interpret. There's price confusion. Is that increase in the price of oil, is that due to greater scarcity? Or is it just due to more money chasing the same goods? Now people, they're not so sure what to do. And the price system becomes a less effective way of coordinating economic action. Inflation, especially high and volatile inflation, it adds noise to prices. So price signals become more difficult to interpret and coordination is made less effective. Money illusion is another problem. Let's face it, human beings are not always perfectly rational. So suppose that over several years, the price of a movie ticket doubles. Even when we know that most prices, including wages, have doubled, we might still feel that movies, they've just become so expensive. I remember when going to the movies was a cheap date. It's too expensive now. If we think that movies were cheap in the past and expensive today, we might go to fewer movies, even when there hasn't been a change in the real price of movies, the price corrected for inflation. Money illusion is when people mistake changes in nominal prices with changes in real prices. If we were perfectly rational, then we ought to just care about the real price. But sometimes that's hard to do because we compare things with the way we remember them. without doing all the fancy corrections and conversions in our head to compare real prices. Inflation has other costs. It redistributes wealth and it breaks down financial intermediation. We're going to take up those costs in the next video.
You're on your way to mastering economics. Make sure this video sticks by taking a few practice questions. Or if you're ready for more math.
All right, so now we're ready to learn more about financial intermediation and how inflation affects it. Now, financial intermediation means the way that banks are able to take the savings of individuals and turn around and lend them to borrowers like you and me who want to buy a car or a house. They're called financial intermediaries because they're essentially channeling funds from lenders to borrowers. But, you know, and it's a very profitable business to be in. But when inflation starts to rise, it becomes very difficult for banks to determine what rates of interest they should pay for deposits, and especially what rates to charge from borrowers so that they can make a profit. All right, so let's check this one out. I will now put it up here on my screen.
In our earlier video on the cost of inflation, we discussed how unexpected inflation, it makes price signals noisier, and it encourages mistakes from price confusion and money illusion. Another cost of inflation is that it makes long-term contracting riskier. Suppose that a bank lends $100 at an interest rate of 10%. But suppose also that over the year, the inflation rate is 10%. At the end of the year, the borrower pays back the bank $110. That looks pretty good on paper. But during the year, money has become less valuable. Due to inflation, what used to cost $100 now costs $110. So what is the bank's real return? Zero. More generally, we can write that the real interest rate is equal to the nominal rate, the rate charged on paper, minus the inflation rate. Inflation reduces the real return on a loan. So inflation redistributes wealth from the lender to the borrower. That's exactly what happened in the 1970s in the United States. Suppose, for example, that you had taken out a home mortgage in the 1960s. As a borrower, you'd have done really well because few people anticipated the high inflation rates of the 1970s. So borrowers ended up paying off their mortgages in dollars that were worth less than anyone had expected. Of course, if lenders expect that the inflation rate will be 10% over the coming year, they'll adjust the interest rate that they charge. If the inflation rate is 10%, for example, then in order to get a real return of 5%, lenders must charge 15%. More generally, nominal interest rates will rise with expected inflation rates. This is called the Fisher effect, after the great American economist, Irving Fisher. You can see the Fisher effect in this data from the United States. Notice, for example, how interest rates and inflation rates were low in the 1960s. But as inflation increased, so did interest rates. Interest rates reached a peak of almost 20% when inflation hit 15% per year. Since that time, inflation has fallen, and so have interest rates. So suppose instead that you took out a mortgage at an interest rate of 17 or 18% near the peak of inflation around 1981. What happened next? Unfortunately for you as a borrower, Inflation fell from 15% to less than 5%. You were willing to take out a mortgage at the very high interest rate of 18% per year only because you expected that your wages would be increasing by at least the rate of inflation, 15% per year. But when inflation is increasing your wages at only 5% per year, the real cost of paying your mortgage is now much higher than you expected. When the interest rate is 18% and the inflation rate is only 5%, that's a real rate on your loan of 13%. That's a great rate for the lender, but it's a terrible rate for you, the borrower. So summarizing, we see that when inflation is higher than expected, wealth is transferred from lenders to borrowers. But when inflation is lower than expected, wealth is transferred from borrowers to lenders. Now imagine that inflation is high and volatile, so it's difficult to predict whether the inflation rate will go up or down. As a lender, do you want to lend? No. You fear unexpected increases in inflation. As a borrower, do you want to borrow? No. You fear unexpected decreases in inflation. So when inflation is difficult to predict, people fear borrowing and lending. And financial intermediation, the process of moving funds from savers to borrowers, it begins to break down. As inflation heats up, for example, long-term mortgages and long-term lending of all kinds becomes more costly and less common. The economy becomes less able to generate and coordinate savings with investment. And as a result, total wealth declines. In the next video, we'll look at a final cost of inflation. Once you get started down the inflation path, inflation is very costly to stop.
You're on your way to mastering economics. Make sure this video sticks.
All right, we can see there's part of the problem because it becomes harder for borrowers and lenders to get together and coordinate with each other. And so we have less borrowing, we have less lending, we have less investing, less jobs are created, and the economy suffers. So if you notice, countries that have very high inflation rates typically also have a very, let's say, weak economy, and often these economies eventually collapse. And that's why, because it breaks down the normal relationship between borrowers and lenders. So now I believe, let's see, where do we leave off here? Okay, so now we're looking here more, why would governments allow this to happen? Because, you know, it depends on, every country's central bank is different. It turns out that countries that have very independent central banks are usually able to resist having high inflation rates. It's countries where the central bank really answers to the federal government that a lot of political pressure is often placed on the central bank. And those countries are the ones that tend to have the highest inflation rates. Because politicians, being what they are, will be happy to see irrational policies being put into place if it helps them get reelected, even if it means that inflation goes up in the long run. So anyway, so let's check this one out. And so again, I will post this here as well.
If inflation is so costly, why do some governments create inflation? In our opening video on hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, we gave one explanation. When the government prints money and uses it to buy goods, that's like a tax, a transfer of wealth from the people to the government. Now, inflation is not an especially effective tax. So governments typically use inflation as a tax only when they're desperate. They can't raise funds in any other way. There are other reasons, however, why printing money can benefit governments. And in some cases, printing money can even benefit an economy. We'll be examining these in much more detail in future videos when we discuss how the government can use fiscal and monetary policy to combat a recession. In this video, we're just going to give a taste of the basic idea. Recall the equation of exchange. MV is equal to PY. Earlier, we used this equation to explain inflation. And what we said is that since V and Y are relatively stable, the only explanation for large and sustained increases in prices is an increase in the money supply, M. We also showed empirically that in the long run, when M doubles, then P doubles, just as the theory predicts. In other words, in the long run, money is neutral. But what about the short run? In the short run, an increase in M, especially an unexpected increase in M, that can increase real output. To understand why, let's turn to the parable of inflation. Consider a small economy consisting of a baker, a tailor, and a carpenter who buy and sell products among themselves. Now think about what happens when a government, like that in Zimbabwe, starts paying its soldiers with newly printed money. At first, the baker is delighted when the soldiers walk through his door with cash for bread. To satisfy his new customers, the baker works extra hours, hires more assistants, bakes more bread, and is able to raise prices. How wonderful, the baker thinks. With the increase in the demand for bread, I'll be able to buy more clothes and more cabinets. Meanwhile, the tailor and the carpenter are thinking much the same thing, as the soldiers are also buying goods from them. When the baker arrives at the tailor to buy shirts, however, he finds that he's been fooled. The soldiers have bought shirts for themselves, and the price of shirts has now gone up. In the same way, the tailor and the carpenter, they discover that the prices of the goods that they want to buy, they've also increased. Although they earned more dollars, their real wages, the amount of goods that the baker, the tailor, and the carpenter, the amount of goods that they can buy with their dollars, that has decreased. When the government next wants to buy goods, it faces higher prices, and it has to print even more money to buy just as many goods as before. Moreover, as the new money enters the economy, the baker, for example, will now race to the tailor and to the carpenter to try and spend the money before prices go up. V increases. Unfortunately, the tailor and the carpenter, they're likely to have had the same idea. And the result is that prices increase even more quickly than the time before. Eventually, as the government continues to print money and buy goods, the baker, the tailor, and the carpenter, they'll catch on. They'll come to expect and prepare for inflation. Instead of working extra hours, the baker, tailor, and carpenter, they'll realize that by the time they get to spend their money, the goods that they want to buy will have already increased in price. And knowing this, the baker, the tailor, and the carpenter will no longer be so happy to see the soldiers entering their shop, waving fistfuls of dollars. And they'll no longer work extra hours, baking more bread, sewing more clothes, or building more cabinets. This is the parable of inflation. We learn two things of importance from the parable. First, an increase in the money supply can boost the economy in the short run. And by the way, that can be a good thing, especially if there's a recession. But this power might also be abused by governments to help swing, say, an election. Second, we also learn from the parable that when the government repeatedly tries to boost the economy by injections of money, the people come to expect the increases in prices, and they come to prepare. So let's think about this using our equation of exchange. MV is equal to PY. In the short run, an increase in M can cause an increase in Y. But then P catches up. So in the long run, the increase is in P only. But now notice the following. If the government wants to reduce inflation, the entire process goes into reverse. So a decrease in the money supply, that can cause a recession. If M decreases, for example, then in the short run, Y falls until P catches up. In the long run, a decrease in M decreases P, but the long run may come only after a short run recession. So one of the biggest costs of inflation is that reducing inflation is also costly. A bit of inflation, it seems like a good idea to boost the economy, but if you keep trying the same trick over and over again, it stops working. And then you're left with all cost and no benefit. A reduction in inflation at that point, it slows the economy and it increases unemployment. So inflation has been likened to a drug. The drug stimulates at first, but then you need more and more to get the same stimulus until you need the drug just to be normal. Finally, when you stop using the drug, you get severe withdrawal pains. This is what happened in the United States in the early 1980s. Inflation was increasing in the 1970s, but by the time we got to the late 1970s, it wasn't helping any longer to reduce unemployment. So we got so-called stagflation, inflation and unemployment together. Then in the early 1980s, under Ronald Reagan, inflation fell, but at the price of a very serious recession in 1981 and 1982. So another reason to avoid too much inflation is that reducing inflation can be very costly indeed.
You're on your way to mastering economics. Make sure this video sticks by taking a few practice questions. Or if you're ready for more macroeconomics,
Okay, now there's one more thing I want you to see. Now, this is not really inflation as such. It's what's something called a bubble. A bubble is something that can arise if people suddenly start buying something, and what happens is the price starts to go up, and people see it as a potentially good investment, and then they want to buy more of it. The price goes up and up and up, and eventually the price stops rising, and then it starts to fall very quickly, and often can crash, as we saw with the real estate market in 2007 and 8. People were buying housing not because they wanted to live in them, but because they wanted to speculate that the price would keep going up and that they could sell them for a profit later on. And so what starts happening is if everybody's buying housing just for that reason, the price keeps going up and up and up, way beyond what the demand for housing can justify. And at some point, eventually, the prices start to fall, and then they fall very quickly. And so we have what's sometimes called a speculative bubble. Now, this particular video is about one of the earliest examples of a speculative bubble. And it occurred with a very surprising type of asset, and that would be the tulip bulb. So anyway, why don't I show it to you? If you've never heard about this before, this is a historical episode that is often called tulip mania. It took place in the Netherlands in the 17th century. And I think you'll find this to be extremely interesting, even though it's not really related to inflation. It is and it isn't, but I think it's worth watching because this is really a very interesting episode in economic history. So let's check this out.
Why do I care so much what people think about me? I think I'm gay.
Today, you can buy several tulips for a couple of dollars. In 1637, you could buy every house on your street for a couple of tulips. The year is 1637, right in the middle of the Dutch Golden Age. This is the era of names such as Rembrandt, Christian Huygens, and Johannes Vermeer. And even though it was in a golden age, the Dutch Republic was a new country, founded only half a century ago when it revolted against the Spanish Empire and started the 80 Years' War. This golden age was spurred in a large part due to the Dutch Republic's invention of early capitalism. And it is here, in Amsterdam, that the first company was founded, the first stock exchange created, and as we will see over the course of this series, it's the place where the first financial bubble burst. This is the story of tulip mania. But what even is a financial bubble? For us economic nerds, this is easy to understand. For the rest of you, here is a short example. Let's say you have a Bitcoin, and that Bitcoin costed you $100. A little later, you sell that Bitcoin for $150, earning you a profit of $50. That evening, you meet with your friends and you tell them all about how you just made $50 with Bitcoin. Your friends, of course, want the same profit, so they buy a bunch of Bitcoins, hoping to sell it later at an even higher price. After a week, they sell each of their Bitcoin for $200. And then new people come in to buy Bitcoin, hearing of all this profit being made. Over time, more and more people come in. Each person is betting they will be able to sell at a higher price to the next person. But eventually, you run out of buyers. You run out of the next person. And then the price goes down. It crashes. This is an economic bubble. And like all bubbles, they must eventually burst. Tulips originally came from Persia and traveled via the Ottoman trade to Western Europe in the 16th century. Tulips come in a variety of colors, and they rapidly became prized above all other flowers. The Dutch Republic saw the rise of a new middle class, and these merchants and traders were willing to pay large sums of money for the newest, the latest, the most spectacularly colored tulips. Each year, new varieties were cultivated. In particular, there was one type of tulip that was prized above all other types of tulips. This tulip had dark-colored stripes or flames on a light background. But what is interesting is that they did not get this color due to the flower's genetics, but because of a virus. But this is the early 17th century, and the field of genetics wouldn't exist for another 200 years. This meant that as a tulip grower, you could never be sure whether you had an ordinary tulip or an extremely valuable flaming tulip. This made tulips a risky investment. Tulip traders usually had their own private garden, but there were no professional tulip traders. As far as I could find out, none of them were. They all had a day job, and tulip growing and trading was a side business for them, a hobby. These men belonged to a new middle class, which was just forming in the Dutch Republic, thanks to the Dutch East India Company and the vast wealth it brought with it. But just because tulips were a hobby didn't mean they were amateurs. In fact, these men knew a lot about this plant, and growing the best one was a serious hobby, not just a casual one. And by the 1620s, a beautiful new flower had emerged, the Semper Augustus. God, don't you just love that name? Anyway, the Semper Augustus was owned by one man, and he was crafty. He knew that if he sold the offspring of this tulip, it was only a matter of time before his customers would grow more, and then he would have competitors, meaning that he would have to lower his price to compete with competitors. So he did what most companies would do in this situation, create a monopoly, meaning that he was the only one who was able to sell the Semper Augustus. But how did he do it? Because if he sold his tulip, his customers would automatically be able to grow more of them. Well, he created a special kind of contract with very specific terms. First, you weren't even allowed to sell your tulip without the express permission of the original owner. And secondly, you weren't allowed to sell any of the offspring from the tulip bulb either. As you might imagine, many traders did not honor this contract, and many an angry merchant went to the Dutch notary office to file an official complaint. Records of these complaints can still be found in the archives of many Dutch cities to this day, and it is through these records that we know just how much tulips were worth during that time. Even though not all merchants honored the deal, most of them did. This way, he was assured that he could control how many of his precious Semper Augustus were being sold, and as a result, the price went up. By 1623, the price for a single Augustus Semper tulip bulb was worth 1,000 guilders. By the end of 1625, that price had risen to 3,000 guilders. To put this into perspective, a skilled artisan, such as a carpenter, would earn about 300 guilders per year. So that meant that by 1625, a carpenter would have to work 10 whole years, not spend any of that on food or a house or anything. And then, after 10 years, he would finally be able to take all his money to a tulip trader and buy a single bulb. And that's without the price going up even further than it already did. And to put this in modern day perspective, an average carpenter in the Netherlands earns about 30,000 euros per year, meaning this bulb would cost about 300,000 euros. 300,000 euros for a single bulb. Because my audience comes from a variety of countries, here is how much it would have cost in other popular countries among my viewers. See?
An official message from Medicare. Turning 65 comes with questions like, how do I enroll in Medicare? What if I'm still working? Where do I start? Get your questions answered at Medicare.gov, paid for by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
You ever wondered what actors and actresses do when they have to get in shape really fast for a movie?
A single tulip of the most valuable breed could sell for 10 times the average yearly wage. In the 1630s, the tulip trade started to change. And one change led to another until eventually the whole thing had become unsustainable and the entire tulip trade would eventually collapse. So let's look how this started. First of all, a system of colleges developed across the main towns in the Dutch Republic, each composed of a core of small traders. They met at a specific inn, usually 2 or 3 times per week, and usually in the evening, as most traders had a day job. Outsiders were welcome, but only through an introduction. Deals took place with the mediation of 1 or 2 neutral observers, and all sales were sealed with a payment of a small surcharge called the wijnkoop, or a wine purchase, of about 2.5%. This 2.5% was spent on food, tobacco, wine, and other luxury goods at the inn. But there was a problem. While there was a large variety of bulbs, the problem was that they couldn't sell as many or as often as they wanted to. Tulips don't grow very fast. You can't harvest every autumn like most crops. In fact, it could take several years before a tulip is able to bloom for the first time. So until it bloomed, you weren't sure what your tulip was going to look like. And so the first change happened. A new type of contract started circulating, a futures contract. Now, some of you are scratching your head, wondering what the hell a future contract is. Well, a future is a type of contract where the buyer purchases a product and then the seller delivers that product once it's ready. So in the case of tulips, you would sign a contract for a tulip bulb, but you don't take possession of the bulb just yet because you wait until it flowers. Well, since you have a contract which states that the owner of the contract is the owner of the tulip, you can simply sell that contract. After all, a futures contract states that the bearer of the contract is also the owner. So give that contract to someone else, and now they are the owner of the tulip. Simple. But why would you buy a tulip if you don't even know whether it is the one you wanted? Well, a future has the advantage that as the buyer, you can usually purchase the product at a lower price in exchange for taking extra risk. As the seller, you reduce your risk by selling early, and so you are assured to make a profit. Maybe not as much as you would otherwise make, but hey, that's why you're selling futures anyway. You don't want to take that risk. So at this point, in 1634, people had slips of paper stating the ownership of a tulip bulb. Remember how I said earlier that traders would only buy and sell tulips while they were in bloom, so they could assess the quality. Well, with a slip of paper, you could much more easily trade tulip bulbs. You no longer needed to wait until a flower bloomed. You could now sell it at any time you wanted. And this is the second major change in the tulip trade. Before, tulip trading was highly seasonal. People would come in, they would look at the tulip, and then the flower would be sold. But now, you could trade it at any time you wanted. So if a particular brand of tulips generally looks good, then you'd pay whatever the price of that particular brand of tulip is at that moment. This makes sense. If a particular breed was worth 10 guilders at the time, you could buy that breed knowing that this flower was probably around 10 guilders anyway, as breeds don't vary that much in appearance. That makes sense. We do the same now when we purchase online. We don't go to the warehouse to check if the smartphone you want to buy is really as good as we've been told. We simply trust that a smartphone is a certain quality and that it is worth a certain amount of money. Simple. Well, not really. But before we delve further into the pit of financial collapse, let's have some trivia to break up this video. Tulips would often be named after the owner or a city. with words added to suggest high quality, such as general or admiral. And as the price of tulips increased, so did the extravagance of naming them. In order to make their bulb sound ever more impressive, there were tulips such as General of Generals of Gouda, because one general wasn't good enough, apparently. As someone working in marketing, I can respect this type of naming system. Okay, so people were now trading slips of paper stating the ownership of a bulb. And as a result, people were now trading more and more. Prices were soaring at this point. And this led to the third major change. When people heard of the insane amounts of profits the tulip traders were making, they wanted in on the action. So many new traders entered the tulip market that it changed everything about the tulip trade. And as prices grew, more and more people who knew nothing about tulips wanted to get in on the profitable tulip trade. So people who knew very little about tulips started buying tulips with the idea that they could sell them for a profit in the future without ever wanting to own a tulip themselves or plan on making a profit on them that was sustainable. They weren't interested in tulips. They were interested in profits. And these new traders changed the tulip trade. It was no longer about a single bulb or a particular breed of tulip. No, from now on, traders were far more interested in buying large amounts of tulips in order to make the most profit. Now, not all tulips were equal, and each breed had its own price, but it was no longer about the quality of each individual tulip bulb. Futures contracts, which previously told you owned a single bulb, now turned into contracts stating you owned 10 or 50 bulbs. And so, with people who knew almost nothing about tulips, buying large sums of tulips, while at the same time being told that the price can only go up. If you remember my example of Bitcoin in the last episode, you may have already guessed where this is going. Prices grew faster and faster. They began to skyrocket by the end of 1636, a few months before the collapse of the tulip prices. Within 3 months, individual bulbs were sold dozens of times and increasing in price more than 10-fold. And the prices of cheaper bulbs increased as much as 20-fold, all in the space of 3 months. Even the most common bulbs, the ones nobody really cared about, were now sold for large sums. By this point, a single bulb was able to purchase a large house. Or if you had a really valuable one, you could buy an entire villa. This was the height of tulip mania. The prices were now so high that you could buy an entire street for only a couple of tulip bulbs. More and more people joined the tulip trade, hoping to buy a couple of bulbs now and sell them for a profit later. But the price only increased because people were expecting it to increase. Now, you might have thought to yourself, how is this any different from gold or company shares today? People often buy it in the hopes that it will be worth more in the future. The difference here is that both of these goods provide actual value to many people and are thus valuable for more than just being a tradable good. We use gold in wedding rings, a medium of exchange, and in electronics. It creates value for you. Jewelry, while being a luxury, still provides value. If, like in the past, you can only buy something using gold, then you will want gold in order to buy things you want to have. And electronics are valuable, so you can watch my videos. Likewise, company shares give you value because you now own a part of a company and you receive a dividend. And sure, a tulip has value because it's pretty, but it's not 10 years of salaries pretty. This is what makes a bubble a bubble. The actual value of the product is a lot lower than the amount of money for which it is traded. And the price was just going up endlessly, it seemed. What is important to remember is that nobody at the time knew for certain what would happen. This was the first bubble, so nobody was sure what would happen in the end. The very idea of a bubble didn't exist yet. There was no previous experience to draw upon. To most people, it just seemed like business as usual.
The media wants us to believe that we're more divided than we are. It's time for conservatives, moderates, and liberals.
Most people, but not all. The prices were becoming so high that some people couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, the prices were too high. If maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't keep increasing in price in the future. And if maybe, just maybe they should sell their tulips before the price would drop. But even though disquiet had been building, the end still came sudden and unexpected. It is the evening of February 5th, 1637. Traders have come together inside an inn in the Dutch city of Haarlem. The men buy a drink, light a cigar, and warm up at the fire. Soon the trading is about to begin. As men take their seats, the first bubble is presented. It is a small bulb, weighing less than half a gram. It's of a valuable breed, but not even close to mature yet. The men start bidding, and it's sold for 56 guilders, about 2 months' worth of salaries for a carpenter. Next, another man shows his tulips, this time on a piece of paper. It reads that the owner of this contract will be able to collect a bulb weighing about 5 grams, still not mature yet. The men look at each other, but nobody makes an offer. Nobody thinks they can make a profit on this bulb. Nobody is willing to take the risk. Eventually an offer is made, but it's lower than expected. It is sold for only 10 guilders. That's okay, the trader thinks. He will just make a profit the next time. This isn't so bad. This is just a one-time setback, right? Another tulip trader comes and shows his own wares. A piece of paper is presented, a mature bulb weighing over 50 grams. Again, the men look around. Again, nobody bites. And again, the merchants only buy it for a much lower price than expected. The men start getting nervous. The price appears to be going down, not up. They have tulips of their own. Tulips that are now worth far less than at the beginning of the evening. So they decide to sell their tulips now instead of waiting for the price to drop even further. And as soon as some traders start selling, the price goes down because there are now more tulips being sold. So in order to compete with the other traders, they now have to lower their price. But as the prices get lower, more traders sell their tulips, meaning they are forced to lower the prices even more, leading to even more people selling, leading to even lower prices, meaning more people sell, meaning lower price. This cycle continued throughout the evening, until by the end of the night, prices had fallen dramatically. By some estimates, prices had dropped by as much as 95%. 95% in a single night. And what happened in Haarlem spread to other cities. Some traders decided to be crafty and take a horse to the nearest city and sell all their now worthless bulbs before the price in other cities would crash as well. And as buyers, sellers, and collectors traveled, prices crashed across the country. Within 4 days, the bubble had burst across the Dutch Republic. So what happened? Why did nobody see this coming? And an even more important question, how come this cycle has repeated itself so many times since the first crisis? Why wasn't the first financial bubble also the last? Well, this question can, in large part, be explained with one simple answer: trust. During the bubble, there were prominent traders who everybody looked up to as sources of trustworthy information. And they said that tulip bulbs are a good investment. So if you don't know enough about the business to make your own assessment, you trust somebody else's. Just as you trust a car mechanic about cars, a carpenter about wood, and a doctor about medicine. And so people trusted traders about trade. But what happens if they are wrong? Well, you have a bad investment at best and a financial bubble at worst. To compare this with a modern day example, the crisis of 2008 happened because we trusted otherwise trustworthy rating agencies on so-called subprime mortgages. They said they were good investments, while in reality they were not. And so banks, investors, and borrowers trusted them to be safe investments. But when it turned out they were not, the bubble burst and an economic crisis was created. Just as people trusted tulips to be a safe investment because other, more knowledgeable, more experienced traders said they were. And when it turned out they weren't, the bubble burst and people lost a lot of money. I hope you learned something here, not just a fun story to tell at a party or at the dinner table, but I hope that you learned some actual economic concepts. That a financial bubble isn't created by a couple of evil people sitting in a room plotting doom, but rather it's a process of one risky investment after another. In the first episode, we talked about how tulips were introduced to the Netherlands and became an expensive luxury product. Then merchants created a lucrative, albeit exclusive, trade in tulips. Then a future contract was introduced, allowing people to trade papers stating the ownership of tulips rather than the physical flowers themselves. That led to more people trading in them. And as more people traded, the price went up, until eventually it just didn't anymore. And then it crashed. So who is to blame here? Was it the original traders, the futures contract, allowing new people to join the trade, or are none of them to blame? And is this just the course of events leading to an unfortunate end result? You tell me. I'm not going to tell you what to think. I think my audience is smart enough to form their own opinion. But I hope that now you understand how an economic bubble happens, that this is not some evil master plan set in motion years ago, but rather a series of seemingly good decisions that benefited the individual but led to the collapse of the trade for the whole collective. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up.
All right. Well, that was more complicated than the other two videos, the other few videos, but he made the very good point that we see this happening over and over again. He mentioned the dot-com bubble, which means in year 2001, well, the newfangled internet stocks went through a similar experience. People thought these were the new exciting stocks of the future, and they bought them at very high prices. And eventually, when it became clear that the earnings were not just there yet, the prices started collapsing. And that is often referred to as the dot-com bubble. And then, of course, in 2008, we had the housing crisis where people were buying houses that they couldn't possibly afford to pay for. The banks were making it so easy to buy houses that people were taking advantage of it. And before you knew it, prices were going through the roof. And eventually the price started to fall, and people lost a lot of money. Financial institutions were wiped out. And then, of course, in 2017, and I'm sure this will happen again here with the Bitcoin is different because it's still not completely clear what exactly these cryptocurrencies really are and what they're for, what they're worth. At least with the the real estate market, people figured, well, housing prices never really go down, do they? So it's safe to keep buying even at very high prices. But Bitcoin is a very abstract concept. And so because it's so poorly understood, it stands to reason that their prices can fluctuate quite a bit. It's not like something that's actually being used for any particular purpose, like gold, for example. At least gold has uses that you can point to and say, well, we can use gold for industrial purposes. So it always has a certain minimum value, but not so with Bitcoin. I can see why that price can go up and down very dramatically. And so probably we have not seen the last of the Bitcoin bubbles, because people get all excited about them, but then they don't really understand what they are. And so the prices can be very volatile. Anyway, at some point, when Greenspan was still the chairman of the Federal Reserve System during the height of the dot-com bubble, people were wondering if maybe the Federal Reserve System should, as one of its duties, be looking out to prevent these types of bubbles from forming. But the problem with something like that is that it's very difficult to spot a bubble while it's taking place, because, historically we've seen several bubbles, but, sometimes prices just go up because of other reasons, like demand, for example. And it's very hard to be sure that we're in a bubble until after the fact. All right, well, anyway, enough of that talk about bubbles. Why don't we now move on to chapter 8? And we're going to introduce, we're going to look at the so-called potential GDP and the natural rate of unemployment. But we're also going to introduce a lot of economic thought, because we're going to be looking at the way that these different schools of thought, how they decide what's important, what's not important, how they explain unemployment, how they explain how recessions take place, and what their policy prescriptions are. So the three basic ones we want to look at are the classical macroeconomists, the Keynesian macroeconomists, and the monetarist macroeconomists. The classical economists go all the way back to the days of Adam Smith. Adam Smith would have been considered the first economist, and he certainly was a classical economist. The classical economists place their faith in markets. They're very skeptical about the role of government. In fact, if anything, they say that government should not butt into the economy because it'll only make things worse. And so they have a lot of confidence that markets will correct any problems that arise. For example, if there's a surplus, prices will fall. If there's a shortage, prices will rise. Now, of course, when the classical macroeconomists were writing, conditions were very different because this is going back to this 18th, 19th centuries. In those days, if unemployment started to go up, wages could actually fall, and that would take care of the problem pretty quickly. But now, wages don't tend to do that. If, let's say, a company is in trouble, the first thing they'll do is eliminate jobs rather than try to lower wages to help reduce the problem. And so, if wages aren't going to fall, then it stands to reason that when the economy is in trouble, then a lot of people will lose their jobs. So that's the kind of thing that the classical economists would not have written about because they'd never experienced it. So their experience was a little bit different than the later economists, such as the Keynesians. Now, the Keynesians are based, their philosophy is based on the writings of John Maynard Keynes. He was an economist, a British economist, and in the 1930s, while the Depression was going on, he became very famous because he wrote several books in which he tried to explain how to get out of the Depression. His idea was that when the economy is in trouble, the government should step in and spend like crazy to stimulate the economy and bring it back up to a more normal level. But he also made it clear that once that had been achieved, the government should return its spending to more normal levels. Now, that's the big point of contention with this Keynesian theory. Governments don't normally reduce spending because of political pressures. It's fine to say, well, we'll increase spending to get out of the Depression and then go back to more normal levels. But once the Depression was over, of course, spending never returned to the original levels. And it just kept growing and growing and growing. And what started happening was that eventually, in the 70s, we experienced something called stagflation, which is a combination of both high unemployment and high inflation. Now, according to the Keynesians, that should have been impossible. Keynes himself said that, you have to choose between either unemployment or inflation. You're never going to get both, but you can't get rid of both of them either. But unfortunately, in the 70s, it turned out that that wasn't true, that we still managed to have high unemployment and high inflation. And a lot of people, in fact, think that we're heading that direction now, given the extremely high rate of inflation we're seeing compared to recent history. And of course, unemployment is not that low, it's not that high, but if the economy starts slowing down, it can go back to very high levels very quickly. So the Keynesians had their day in the sun. They were very influential throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then in the 70s, when we experienced stagflation, it became clear that maybe this wasn't the best approach. And that's when the monetarists came along. The monetarists had their day in the 80s. And according to them, a lot of economic activity is driven by changes in the money supply. So according to them, the business cycle, let's say we have a lot of inflation, a lot of economic growth, it's probably because the money supply is growing too fast. If we have a lot of unemployment, it's probably because the money supply is growing too slowly. So their prescription for just about every problem was to change this growth of money to achieve our policy objectives. And in fact, as we saw in the video, Milton Friedman was the most famous of all the monetarists. He did eventually win the Nobel Prize, so he knew what he was talking about. He's the one who had that very famous saying about how inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon, because he's basically saying that that is why prices rise in the first place, because the money supply is growing more quickly than the output of goods and services. So their prescriptions would be very different than the Keynesians. During a recession, the monetarists would have recommended raising the money supply, whereas the Keynesians would have been more interested in increasing government spending. and possibly lowering taxes as a stimulus to the economy. So anyway, we also have other schools of thought. These are just three of the more, let's say, popular ones that have had maybe the most influence on economic policy throughout history. But we want to start by introducing this concept of potential GDP. And potential GDP has been reached when all the factors of production, by which we mean land, labor, and capital, and entrepreneurship, are being used as efficiently as possible. In other words, nothing is going to waste. And so at that point, we are said to have reached full employment. And as we saw in an earlier chapter, that doesn't mean that nobody's unemployed. It means that the only unemployment we have is either cyclical or, structural or frictional, that there's no cyclical unemployment. And I think you mentioned that for the longest time, economists believed that the full employment level was an unemployment rate of about 5%. The thinking was that between frictional and structural unemployment, we can expect to have about a 5% unemployment rate, even when we're at full employment. But that proved to be wrong because just before the COVID struck, our unemployment rate had fallen all the way down to 3.5%, which proved that obviously it's possible to have a lower unemployment rate. And some people believe that the reason why it had fallen so far is because technology and other factors had made it possible for us to produce goods and services more efficiently than ever before. And that would naturally, of course, trigger a reduction in unemployment, as more employers would be interested in hiring more people due to the higher productivity. There's a lot of theories about that. Nobody can be really sure, but it is for sure a fact that unemployment did fall below 5%. And at the same time, though, inflation stayed below 2%. So it seemed like everything was going great. And of course, the COVID had to happen. And so now the economy is still trying to recover from that. The unemployment rate is quite low again, but unfortunately, the inflation rate is now zooming along. And it remains to be seen how much higher it's going to go and how high the Fed will have to raise interest rates to prevent inflation from getting any worse. And as you saw in the video, of course, they were discussing how important this is because reducing inflation can be very, very costly. Specifically, it can trigger a great deal of unemployment, and it can also lead to a much slower economy. In fact, in the early 80s, when inflation was in double digits, it got as high as something like 13%. The Fed started raising rates to very high levels to get inflation back under control. And while that certainly worked, there was a couple of years in there when the unemployment rate was over 10%, which is pretty bad. 10% unemployment is really bad. It doesn't sound like a huge number, but it means an awful lot of people are out of work. So it imposed a lot of pain on the economy. There's no doubt about that. But it was necessary because otherwise the inflation rate might still be in the double digits, and with all the resulting problems that causes. But instead, within about 2 years, inflation was back down to about 2 or 3%. And it stayed there pretty much for the next 40 years. Unfortunately, we may have to go through the same thing in the near future if the Fed has to keep raising rates to reduce our inflation rate. Who knows how long this is going to take, but it's going to be ugly. There's no question about that. All right, well, anyway, so the factors of production over short periods of time are assumed to be fixed. In other words, we're assuming that land, capital, and entrepreneurship are fixed in the short run. Labor is the only one that can change. Now, this is, of course, because people who are not in the labor force can suddenly decide to go out and look for work. The labor is flexible. It's very flexible. The amount of land we have in the economy, the amount of capital, the number of entrepreneurs, they don't change very quickly. So we make a distinction in economics between the short run and the long run. The short run typically is meant to be the time frame when only one input is variable, and that is typically labor. In the long run, we assume that everything is variable. So as more labor is employed, GDP will change as well. Now, we're going to introduce a very important type of graph here. The mathematical relationship between the amount of labor being used with other resources, the fixed resources, and the amount of output that we can produce gives us something called the production function. Now, it can be expressed as an equation, and it frequently is, but we can also show it with a chart or a graph. So let's say that we have a small company that is producing soda. Okay, it's a small factory, and there's a lot of machinery in there because most of the work is being done by machines, but there also are workers in this company too. There has to be some people, of course. So what we're going to see now is a chart that shows how much labor we are employing on the left, and on the right, the corresponding amount of soda that we can produce with that amount of labor. So this chart is giving us a lot of very useful information. For example, oh, by the way, before we discuss that, if you put this on a graph, it's called the total product of labor curve that we're looking at, which means how much output are we getting from each different quantity of labor. And this is a typical shape for this production function, or total product curve. What's happening here is that if you look at it carefully, you'll see that initially output is increasing pretty quickly. Okay, so in other words, if it's kind of hard to tell with this graph, but at first the output is rising very quickly. Then it starts to slow down. It's still increasing, but at a progressively decreasing rate. And then we reach a point where we can't increase our output any further. This is the maximum output right here. And then all of a sudden, if we keep trying to hire more workers, the amount of output actually decreases. So we have these three phases that we're going through, basically. At first, output increases very rapidly. Then as we add more workers, the output continues to rise, but more slowly. It reaches a maximum value, and then after that, it actually goes down. So you're probably wondering, how is this possible? I mean, we're hiring more workers. Why isn't more output being produced? Well, the key to the whole thing is that they're using the same amount of resources. They're stuck with the same amount of capital. In other words, for a bottling plant like this, there's only so many machines in there. There's only so much space in the building. There's only so much room. And so the issue here is that you've got a lot of people, as you start hiring more people, trying to use the same amount of equipment and trying to work in the same amount of space. And so through no fault of their own, well, they start to get in each other's way. They have to stand around waiting for each other to be finished with the machinery, things like that. So as more and more workers are hired, the output will continue to increase for a while, but eventually there will come a point where it can't go up any further. And then if anything, it starts to go down because people are probably getting in the way of each other. And so this is what normally happens when there's a single variable input. And so what we're seeing here is described, we're going to see it any second now, is described as the law of diminishing returns. So in other words, as we hire more workers, the extra output each one produces is at first increasing, then it decreases, and then eventually it becomes negative. So this is what we mean by the law of diminishing returns. So if you were to draw up a list of the most important concepts in economics, this has to be in the top 10, no question about it. The law of diminishing returns. Anytime we try to produce more output with one variable input and the rest being fixed, we're always going to experience something like this. It will never be the case that the output just continues to rise. Instead, it reaches a maximum point and then it starts to fall. So naturally enough, this company is not going to go past this point. If anything, they'll probably hire even less labor than that. In order to determine how many workers they're going to hire, we need to know two things. Number one, how much does the labor cost them? And number two, how much can we sell the soda for? So, I mean, as you can imagine, workers will continue to be hired. Let me just add this in here. Workers will be hired until the revenue received from the soda they produce equals the wages paid to the workers. That's as far as it can go. After that, they have to stop because the revenues are tied to the number of units that are being produced. And the problem is that as we hire more and more workers, that is what's actually going down. So there comes a point where it no longer pays to hire more workers because the extra revenue they're bringing in is not enough to cover their salaries. So, by the way, what's interesting about this is that this helps us to explain why the supply curve is upward sloping. Because as you can see, in the short run at least, no matter what we're trying to produce, as long as some of their inputs are fixed, we're always going to run into this law of diminishing returns. And so the cost of producing more and more units of a product will go up. And so we will not be able to sell more units unless we raise our price and still make a profit. So this total product curve represents or illustrates the law of diminishing returns. And if you want to look at the numbers, what you'll notice is that when we hire the first worker, output goes up by 3. It's 0 initially. You can't have any soda without people. Okay, you need at least one person working in the factory to make soda. They're not, I mean, in the future when there's all robots doing everything, maybe that won't be true anymore. But right now, at this point in time, in order to have soda, we must have workers, even if it's just there to watch the machines. Now, when the second worker comes along, output goes up by 5. Okay, but then when the third worker comes along, output only goes up by 4. The fourth worker brings us 2 more units of soda. The fifth worker doesn't add anything. Output stays the same. And then finally, the sixth worker is where we're really in trouble because we're actually losing some output. So now why is this happening? Well, in the beginning, what's happening is that we're experiencing something called specialization. Okay, so initially, hiring more workers adds more to total output. This is due to specialization, where each worker can focus on 1 or 2 tasks that he or she is very skilled at. Okay, so like here's another example I often use. Like imagine a McDonald's. Now, pretty much, if you walk into McDonald's, what are the people in there doing? Well, you've got the people up front who are taking the orders, and you've got the people in the back who are actually doing the cooking. So if you only have one worker in your McDonald's, that one person has to do both. They have to take the orders and they have to cook the food. Once you get the second person in the door, one person can just stay up the front all the time, take the orders, and the other person can just stay in the back and do all the cooking. So you can imagine that that would increase output quite significantly because the person who's best at cooking is in the back cooking. The person who's best at dealing with customers is in the front taking the orders. So this is what we mean by specialization. And so at first, that's going to give us a huge increase in output. But after a while, the benefit will start to diminish because, you know, then before you know it, you've got 2 workers in the front and 2 in the back, and then 3 of each. And so each extra worker is not contributing quite as much to the amount of sales that McDonald's can have. But in the early going, that specialization is making it possible to significantly increase output. It's kind of like an entrepreneur who runs his own company and does everything himself. And then when he reaches a certain level, he starts to hire workers to take care of mundane tasks like answering the phone and crap like that. It's going to give him more time to work on the actual company. And so that's going to provide a lot of benefits, but at some point the benefits start to dissipate. But in the early going, the entrepreneur is able to hire people to take care of these tedious tasks. It's certainly going to increase output quite a bit. So that's what this graph is showing us. So anyway, yes. Now, how quickly this happens depends on the circumstances of that particular company. If it's a very small company with very few resources, this output increasing more slowly and actually falling may happen very quickly. For a much bigger company, it might take a while for this to happen because they have plenty of room, plenty of equipment, and that type of thing. But sooner or later, this will happen. It's guaranteed. So this is the law of diminishing returns. And this is something that's, it's a very important principle of economics. And let's see now. Oh, by the way, now everything we just said refers to the short run. Short run, again, is the time frame when only one input can be variable. In the long run, though, not only can all the inputs change, but also technology can change. And so if technology accelerates or advances, then we can typically produce more output with the same resources just because we're using the resources more efficiently. And if that happens, then the entire curve shifts up. Because let's say, for example, previously, 3 workers could produce 12 units of soda. Now, all of a sudden, the same 3 workers can produce 16 units of soda. Why is this? Well, maybe the company bought more efficient machinery. It's like, I think a good example of this would be a Starbucks. Imagine that the company comes along and they say, listen, those blenders we're using are not powerful enough, and they replace all their existing blenders with much faster, more powerful blenders. Well, then the same workers could produce more frozen drinks. I mean, they're the same workers, they have the same skill sets, but just because the blenders are more powerful, all of a sudden they can produce a lot more output. And so that's exactly what we're seeing here. Okay, so technology can increase our output. Now, if you notice, though, even on the new curve, we still experience the law of diminishing returns. That's never going to change, but it will occur at a higher level of output. So in other words, we'll still get a benefit from this. We'll still get more output no matter how many workers we're using, but we still experience the law of diminishing returns. All right. So now we're going to take a closer look at the labor market. We're going to see that labor is a commodity like anything else. There's a supply for labor and there's a demand for labor. And as you can probably imagine, wages are determined by equilibrium in this market. So we're going to take a closer look at labor markets here. But I can see it's after 8, so we may as well have our break right now. So we'll have our normal break right now. And when we get back, we'll dive more deeply into this discussion about the labor market. And if we have time, we'll start to watch 1 or 2 of the videos that discuss the different schools of thought and how they approach economic problems differently. It's they're very interesting videos because they explain very well the outlook of these different schools. And they also explain where they kind of go wrong. You know, what problems are there with each of these schools of thought? And so you'll like them, don't worry. So, but first we'll have our break, and then we'll discuss the labor market, and then we'll start looking at these videos based on the different schools of thought. All right, so Let's knock it off for a bit, and then we'll be back in a few minutes. All right. Let's look at the labor market. Now, as I mentioned before, labor has a supply and a demand. The supply of labor comes from individuals who are willing to work. The demand comes from, usually in the US at least, mainly private companies, although the government also hires a lot of labor as well. So the demand for labor, as you would imagine, is the relationship between the quantity of labor that employers wish to hire. And we're going to think of this in terms of real wages rather than nominal wages. Economists have determined that when workers come into the workforce, it's really real wages that they're attracted to. They understand that nominal wages can be affected by inflation. So what they're really trying to do is maximize their real wages. And so employers are very well aware how much it costs to hire workers. And so in this model, at least, we're going to be thinking in terms of real wages. Okay, in other words, inflation adjusted wages. And of course, really, I mean, ultimately, that's what really matters to everybody, because that is what determines your purchasing power. So if wages go up, obviously labor becomes more expensive, and employers will do whatever they have to do to continue producing their products, but with less labor than they might otherwise have used. So here's a good example of this. You've probably noticed in McDonald's that when you go in the door now, you can certainly go up to the front and you can order your food from a real person, but they now have these enormous computer screens there where you can just punch a bunch of buttons and they will bring the food to your table. And the whole point of that is that while those screens must have been terribly expensive, the advantage of those screens is that they don't have to get paid wages. In other words, the whole idea is that McDonald's is replacing labor with capital. Those machines would be considered a form of capital. And so while it might be very expensive in the short run, they obviously expect that wages will rise in the future and that this will save them a lot of money in the long run. And so that's a sign that wages are rising in real terms, and that companies like McDonald's, which have very small profit margins to start with, are feeling the pinch. And so they're trying to find alternative ways to continue to stay in business without hiring quite as much labor as they used to. I'm sure they still hire a lot of labor. I mean, they have to have people there, but this is one way they can keep that down to a minimum. Oh, and they're not the only one. I mean, I read about there's somewhere in Washington State, I guess it's Seattle, Amazon has a warehouse center. And from what I understand, every single job in that warehouse is being performed by robots. That's what I read. In other words, what happens is in this warehouse, they keep all the merchandise before it's sold. And apparently it takes a lot of time to get it organized. And, you know, like, let's say that somebody places an order and now the robots have to go in the back and find all this merchandise and package it up and send it out. Just the searching part can be very time consuming, apparently. So the robots are apparently very quick and efficient compared to people. And so it makes sense for Amazon to invest money in expensive robots because, you know, they obviously don't ever need to sleep. They don't need to eat. They don't go on break. Their wages don't go up. They don't have wages. So Amazon sees this as a good long-term investment. And again, it's a way that they can minimize the use of labor and yet still thrive as a company. So, of course, as you would imagine, like the demand for any other product, there's a negative or inverse relationship between the quantity demanded and real wages. It's just that simple. So when real wages go up, employers will hire less labor. Okay. And also, by the way, this is why we see a lot of products being produced in foreign countries instead of in the United States. A good example of this would be sneakers. Companies like Nike, they tend to produce their sneakers not in the United States, but in countries like Indonesia, where wages are quite low, because apparently there's a lot of manual labor involved in making sneakers. It's not 100% done with machines. There's still human beings have to be involved. So, you know, Americans, of course, get paid very well. So Nike looks around the world for other countries where sneakers can be produced at a much lower cost because labor is much cheaper in those countries like Indonesia. And so that's why this happens. So anyway, so all of this means that the demand curve for labor will be negatively or downward slope, just like any other demand curve you've ever seen. And so here's a quick example. The labor demand for a small country. So we have all these different possible real wages, dollars per hour, the amount of labor that's demanded, millions of hours per year, and these are the points on the demand curve. And so it's exactly as we would expect. at low wages, we have high quantities demanded of labor, and vice versa. And this is exactly what you would expect to see. It's downward sloping. And A, remember, was where wages were so high that no labor was hired at all. And then finally, point G is where wages are zero. And so workers, nobody wants to work at that wage, but employers would love to hire 12 million people if they work for free. And then we have everything in between. Supply, now this is what's coming from the workers themselves. And, you know, to a certain degree, they can choose how much they're willing to work. Okay, now obviously they need enough money to live on, but they do have decisions to make. Like, for example, some people work at a company where you're allowed to work overtime. Okay, and typically with overtime, you get paid more per hour. Some people are eager to work overtime because they really want that extra money, and some people couldn't be bothered. So the amount of labor that an individual supplies will of course depend on how much they're being paid. The higher the real wage, the more they will want to work. In fact, even for people who don't want to work overtime, there eventually will reach a point where if wages are high enough, even those people would like to work overtime. It's just a question of finding out how high that wage has to go. So higher real wages means workers are willing to put in more hours and more people are willing to work. Okay, in other words, the labor force will grow typically when real wages rise. So we're going to put together another chart, a supply schedule. And of course, here you can see the opposite is happening. As the real wage rises, more and more people are willing to work. And so naturally enough, this means that we're going to have a positively sloped supply curve. Yes, exactly. And so now, of course, we're going to bring them together and see how that determines the equilibrium wage rate. And so I put them together in a nice chart here. And you can see that in this economy, at a real wage of $15 an hour, 6 million people will want to work, or 6 million hours will be made available, and 6 million hours will be demanded by employers. So this is our equilibrium position. And there we go. You can see from the graph where they intersect, $15 an hour, 6 million hours of labor. Now, of course, just like in earlier chapters, if something changes, these curves can shift around, and that would change the equilibrium wage rate as well as the equilibrium quantity. For example, if productivity goes up, workers are more productive for whatever reason, then the demand for labor would go up. So you might find demand going from, let's say, demand curve 1 to 2 due to, let's say, higher productivity. The supply could change for several reasons, depending, you know, because this influences how worthwhile is it for people to work. So let's say, for example, people just decided that they want to work more. It could happen. They need more money. They want to buy more luxury items, whatever. Then the supply could go up. What the curve now, remember too here, because the real wages on the vertical axis, a change in the wage will not shift these curves, only external factors. If just the wage changes, then we'll move up and down the same curves. But if an external factor changes, then the entire demand or supply curve will change. And that, of course, will affect the equilibrium wage rate and the quantity of labor that's demanded. All right. Now, with all that being said, let's get back to this discussion about these three schools of thought. So remember, the classicals, really the earliest economists were definitely classical economists. They probably would have been in the majority throughout the 18th and 19th century, and maybe even the early 20th century. The Keynesian approach really was popularized during the Depression. And the monetarists came along and became more influential when it became clear that the Keynesian philosophy was no longer working in the 70s as we started to experience stagflation. Now, there's more than just these three. In fact, I think I was able to find some videos for other schools of thought as well, some of which are even more modern than these. So what I wanted to start with, let's see, where's my list? Oh, the natural, yes, we want to see this video first because they're discussing what we were just talking about, the so-called natural rate of unemployment. And then we can start looking at the different schools of thought. So let's take a look at this one first. Okay, where are my? Here we go. So let's put this in the chat room. So you can watch it at home or here.
The natural rate of unemployment is defined as the rate of unemployment that would occur in an economy if there were no cyclical unemployment, or unemployment correlated with the ups and downs of the business cycle. In other words, it's the rate of frictional plus structural unemployment. Now, unfortunately, we can't really observe that natural rate of unemployment. We can only estimate it. This figure shows one estimate of the natural rate alongside the actual unemployment rate. As you can see, the natural rate of unemployment changes slowly over time, whereas the actual unemployment rate fluctuates quite a bit around that natural rate. Now, why do we care about the natural rate of unemployment? We care because economists think that under some conditions, the government can reduce cyclical unemployment through fiscal and monetary policies. Things like spending more money, cutting taxes, or increasing the money supply. These policies, however, are unlikely to change the natural rate of unemployment. That is, frictional plus structural unemployment. So when the unemployment rate is close to the natural rate, that suggests that the scope for monetary and fiscal policy is diminished. For example, if we return to our graph, by 2015, 7 years after the Great Recession, the actual unemployment rate was very close to that natural rate of unemployment. So by this estimate, the time for fiscal and monetary policy had passed. Clearly, the concept of the natural rate of unemployment is tied to theories about how the government might use fiscal and monetary policy to smooth the business cycle. To learn more about business cycles, click here.
Okay, well, that was nice and concise. So that's pretty much what we were talking about. So now I think we'll start with the monetarists. I find them to be one of the more interesting groups. So we'll see what they have to say about things like the business cycle and unemployment and how to reduce unemployment, how to keep inflation low. So let's see how they approach these different issues.
Monetarism is another framework for thinking about business cycles. Nobel laureate Milton Friedman of the University of Chicago, he was the most famous proponent of monetarism. And as the name suggests, monetarism emphasizes the importance of the money supply, and it emphasizes the decisions central banks make about what to do with the money supply. Now, monetarism is based on something called the quantity theory of money. That means in the long run, the absolute amount of money in an economy doesn't matter, doesn't influence real output or real employment. But in the short run, changes in the rate of inflation can matter. So there are two potential dangers in monetarism: too much inflation and too little inflation. Let's think first about too much inflation, because this is a big part of how monetarism became more popular.
In the 1970s, in America, rates of inflation were considered to be too high. And monetarism had a way to explain this. It said the Federal Reserve was creating too much new money for the economy, and that means prices will be rising, and inflation tends to distort the allocation of economic resources. Individuals cannot tell which prices are going up because of the inflation and which prices are going up because something is more or less valuable. And that what we should do is lower the rate of inflation and bring about more economic stability. So at the time, a lot of Keynesian economists were accepting this higher rate of inflation. But monetarism was saying that yes, at first, more inflation is going to get you higher economic output. But pretty quickly, people figure out that there's inflation going on, and that inflation ceases to be effective in stimulating the economy. On the other side of the ledger, there's the danger that monetary growth will be too low. And that means the rate of price inflation will be too low, or there may be deflation altogether. And in that setting, according to monetarism, aggregate demand will be too low. In this case, monetarist and Keynesian doctrine, they're actually pretty similar. Monetarists, like Keynesians, believe that a lot of nominal wages are sticky. That is, they can't be readjusted or renegotiated all the time. This may be a matter of contract or a matter of law, minimum wages, or maybe just a matter of workplace morale. But when you have sticky wages and that flow of nominal purchasing power, that flow of money through an economy, when it declines, well, wages cannot just fall in tandem, and employers will lay off some workers, and you will get a business cycle downturn.
Okay, here we go.
So for monetarists, there's a kind of Goldilocks rule. It's desired that there be a constant rate of money supply growth. Sometimes that's been given as about 2 to 3%. Not too high, not too low. In general, monetarists believe in constraining the central bank through rules. They don't trust the central bank to have a lot of discretion and to turn on a dime and make a lot of very complicated, precise decisions. Monetarists emphasize that lags are long and variable. The information of policymakers can be unreliable. So they simply want this stable rule, which rules out the two cases of inflation too high and inflation too low. So far, so good. Monetarism has had a huge impact. And because of Milton Friedman and other monetarists, economists now look much, much more at money supplies and central bank policies. But that said, monetarism still has some important problems. First, monetarism is quite an incomplete account of business cycles. A lot of business cycles can be caused by, say, the bursting of bubbles or problems in credit markets or negative real shocks or other factors. And monetarism just doesn't have a lot to say about these cases. Second, monetarism assumes that there's this notion of the money supply as a single well-defined thing. But in fact, empirically, there are many different money supply measures. There are narrow measures, such as currency plus bank reserves held at the Fed. Or you could add in demand deposits, savings deposits, different kind of credit relationships. Which of those is the true real money supply? Which of those should we stabilize? Turns out those different measures of the money supply, they don't always move together so closely. And if we stabilize one of them, well, other measures of the money supply may not be that stable at all. Finally, there's another problem with monetarism. If the central bank really does fix a rate of growth for the money supply, this can make it harder to respond to other kinds of shocks. What if there's a negative real shock, such as an oil price hike? Some economists think the central bank should then be more expansionary. What if interest rates turn volatile? Maybe then again, the central bank should expand credit a bit more. There may be a shock to velocity. The rate at which that money turns over in the economy may change. And at least under simple forms of monetarism, again, the central bank cannot easily adjust for that. It's the case, in fact, there's now an offshoot doctrine of monetarism, sometimes called market monetarism or nominal GDP targeting. It says, yes, we start with monetarism, but we actually want to allow the central bank the ability to respond to those changes in velocity. Now, monetarists, who generally do not trust in discretion, are willing to put up with these shocks. But in the real world, there's a big debate. Many people believe the central bank actually should go beyond the confines of this very limited rule and try to offset some of these other kinds of shocks hitting an economy. So in sum, monetarism is really important, but still it is considered a somewhat incomplete doctrine of business cycles.
You're on your way to mastering economics. Make sure this video sticks by taking a few practice questions. Or if you're ready for more macroeconomics, click for the next video.
Okay, well, now you know what monetarism is about, or at least you have a very brief overview of it. It's a very intriguing theory. And of course, it did become popular in the 80s because we could see that there were obviously problems with Keynesianism. In particular, during the Depression, it might have worked well because the economy was in really rough shape, but as they kept being used during the following decades, really all it ended up doing was raising inflation without stimulating the economy very much. And so that's why we wound up with high unemployment and high inflation in the late 70s. So anyway, I think we have time for one more. Let's see. All right, let's look at the Keynesians. Okay, the other extreme, basically. These are the people who have a complete, absolute faith in government spending to basically spend our way out of trouble. And they don't want to hear anything about rules or money or inflation. They just think that they should spend, and stimulate the economy.
Business cycles and recessions are some of the worst things that can happen to economies. They mean lower output and higher unemployment and more human misery. Now, in macroeconomics, the causes of business cycles, that's a contentious topic, and it involves at least 4 major schools of thought. The Keynesians, the monetarists,
Hey, what's up?
the real business cycle theorists, and finally, the Austrians. And if you disagree on the causes of business cycles, odds are you'll also disagree on the proper remedies. In this series of videos, we're going to dive into each major business cycle theory and then use them all to better understand the Great Recession of 2008. Let's start with the Keynesians. Keynesian economics is named after John Maynard Keynes, a British economist who in 1936 wrote a very famous book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. In Keynesian economics, there's one key idea, and it's called aggregate demand. So this is very different from the doctrine of real business cycle theory, where the key problem is supply. Now, if you understand this idea of aggregate demand, you'll see, as we get to, why Keynesians tend to favor activist monetary and fiscal policy. But first, let's work through aggregate demand just a bit. Let's break it down into its component parts. C plus I plus G plus net exports. That's consumption, plus investment, plus government spending, plus how much we're selling abroad to other countries on net. Those pieces of the puzzle, that's how much flow of expenditure or aggregate demand there is to sustain labor hires in a given period. That is what, in the Keynesian model, keeps people at work. Now, there's a key assumption here. In the Keynesian model, typically, nominal wages are sticky. Think of a wage as just another price. It's the price of labor. In a typical market, if demand falls, then the price falls and the market clears. If that were true in the labor market, a drop in aggregate demand would mean wage cuts, not people losing jobs. But wages are unlike many other prices. They don't always adjust so quickly. Hence, we say they are sticky. Why is that? Well, there may be a long-term contract, there may be a law such as the minimum wage law, or sometimes it's just worker morale. So how does that work then? Well, if the flow of aggregate demand expenditure into an economy slows down because wages cannot be cut, well then workers have to be laid off. And that will lower the flow of aggregate demand expenditure all the more because there's lower employment, lower production, less being consumed, less being invested. The key example here, it really is the Great Depression in the 1930s. Starting in 1929, a lot of American banks failed. Depositors lost their money. This was before governmental guarantees. The money supply fell by about a third, and the stock market crashed. So there was less consumer spending and less investment. This led to a Great Depression and high levels of unemployment. More recently, the Great Recession of 2008 also had a significant Keynesian element. We're going to cover that in a separate video. Keep in mind, in a typical Keynesian scenario, If consumption and investment are falling, usually government spending is going to end up falling as well, because there's less revenue being produced in the economy, less tax revenue, and unless governments really borrow a lot, well, that's going to hurt government's ability to spend. That will be an additional negative shock to aggregate demand. So graphically, in a simple aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, what does this look like? It's pretty straightforward. Take the aggregate demand curve and shift that back and to the left. And you will see pretty simply that output goes down in this model. Also in this setting, there may be some second order effects. The aggregate supply curve may end up shifting back and to the left as well. For instance, imagine some laid off workers. They end up demoralized or they lose their workplace contacts. In the longer run, those people are probably going to be less productive. What are the potential remedies here? Well, Keynesians tend to favor activist monetary and fiscal policies. Central banks should expand the money supply to help maintain that flow of nominal expenditure. They should lower interest rates and have easy conditions for credit. Keynesians also tend to favor a lot of government deficit spending. That is, governments should spend more, start new public works programs, try to put people to work, and fund those programs by borrowing money, even if the revenue isn't there from the economy right now. Again, the government is doing everything possible to restore that flow of aggregate demand. So, what are some of the problems in Keynesian theory? First, Keynesian economics doesn't always explain why aggregate demand fell in the first place. In this sense, Keynesian economics may rely on some other mechanisms. Furthermore, sometimes what Keynesians call aggregate demand problems, well, yes, they may be aggregate demand problems on the surface, but beneath that, there's some deeper, maybe hidden sectoral problem in the economy, or slow growth or productivity is the actual problem. So there's some deeper malady. Weak aggregate demand is just a kind of symptom. So just jacking up aggregate demand, even if it's a good short-run protection, it may not always be the best way of solving your problem. Second, many economists believe that actually monetary policy usually is enough to stabilize the flow of nominal expenditures. If that's the case, Keynesianism, in fact, will evolve into another doctrine called monetarism. We're going to cover that in a separate video. Keynesians also tend to have a lot of faith in government's ability to time and target fiscal policy. But will government spend that money quickly enough? Will government actually succeed in hiring the unemployed workers? Those are all open questions. Another problem, Keynesian economics predicts that you either have high unemployment or high inflation, but not both at the same time. During America's downturn of the late 1970s, there was a kind of stagflation, high inflation and high unemployment together. That wasn't what the Keynesians had predicted. And during those years, a lot of economists actually turned away from Keynesian ways of thinking. There's also the public choice critique of Keynesian economics. The Keynesian recipe is to run higher deficits and recessions, but in good times to have a balanced budget or even a surplus. But a lot of governments don't do that. They like having the deficits all the time. So it could be there's an asymmetry built into the Keynesian system where over time you get too many deficits and too much debt, and perhaps eventually a fiscal crisis. In sum, Keynesian economics is really important. It's central to the modern understanding of macroeconomics. That said, there are also some significant limitations to Keynesian ways of understanding the world.
You're on your way to mastering it.
All right. So, all right, so that's that. Now, let's see, just a quick look at what's coming up in chapter 9. Oh, okay. Yeah, we still have this to go. So I think it said that the second midterm would be 5 through 8. I think I was wrong. I think it'll be 5 through 9 because this goes along nicely with what we were just doing. 10 is where we really switch gears completely. We'll be looking at financial markets in 10, and then in 11 and 12, we'll be looking at money and the Federal Reserve System. So I think that I misspoke before. The second midterm will ultimately be on 5 through 9. And so since we haven't gotten to 9 yet, I think I have to double check, but I believe that's the way it was structured. But for right now, all you have to do Let's see, is there a problem set here? I don't think so. We just finished 7. Yes, there was a problem set for 7. Okay, so you can work on that. This is the inflation chapter. So focus on that, and then we'll discuss next time what to do about the second midterm and the remaining problem sets. Okay, so for now, what I'd like you to do is then just finish up whatever assignments are still outstanding, but this is what's coming up next. And so then next time we'll finish watching these videos about the different schools of thought. We'll go through economic growth, which is not a very long chapter. And then we'll switch our attention to the financial markets and money and the Fed, which to me is one of the more exciting parts of the course. But that's just my opinion. But you might agree with me when we're done, but we'll see how that goes. So I guess for now, we're done for the night. And I'll post any new announcements if I think of any. But for right now, let's just focus our attention on the chapter 7 problem set. And of course, don't forget there's still a midterm that is due fairly soon. So that should be enough for now. So I'll just see you all next time then. Okay, good night. Good night. You're welcome.